Welcome to Chapter 12, Functional Training. The purpose of this chapter is to examine the concepts and guidelines for functional training designed to maximize the transfer of physiological gains made during training to real-world performance. Understanding the essential elements of functional training, which are rooted directly in the concept of discovery learning, constraints-based practice, and deliberate practice, provides a basis for creating programs that maximize transfer and therefore maximize performance. After reading this chapter, you should be able to define and describe the key elements of functional training and how functional training differs from practice and conventional physical training. You should be able to list and describe the physical and psychological contributors to the production of strength and power and the difficulties and controversies in strength and power testing and training. You should be able to explain the key components to transfer strength and power gains from the weight room to the athletic playing field, define functional psychophysical training, and explain the steps to create psychophysical training programs in athlete populations and non-athlete populations. And finally, you should be able to explain the benefits and shortcomings of using virtual reality as a functional training mode. Motor skill performance relies on underlying abilities, and enhancing abilities are common targets for improving performance. Yet, improved abilities only increase the capability for skilled performance and do not always transfer to improved performance on the field. Maximizing transfer is the goal of functional training, which has been defined by Ives and Shelley as bringing real-life situational needs and constraints to the training environment. Functional training differs from conventional training in that the goal is to maximize transfer of abilities rather than maximize the abilities themselves. Functional training often does not permit full muscle activation, even at maximal effort, because segmental stability and balance may be upset. Functional training differs from practice in that the goal is to develop physiological abilities rather than technical, motor, and mental skills. Devising a functional training program that truly maximizes transfer can be difficult and requires considerable thought on the part of the trainers, athletes, and the coaches. The importance of strength and power training as a component of wellness and health in non-athlete populations is increasingly recognized, and obviously it's profound in terms of the athletic training to prefer performance realm as well. Despite documentation of strength and power training methods back to the ancient Greeks, however, debate still continues about the best way to train, particularly in producing gains that transfer to better performance on the playing field, at work, or even at home. Strength is defined as the maximum force or torque one can exert under specific task constraints. That means that strength can be determined by one repetition max. You can do that in a bench press or in a maximal voluntary isometric squat lift, a knee extension on an isokinetic dynamometer. There's lots of different ways that we can represent our maximum force with different types of equipment. Power, on the other hand, is used in the context of strength training and conditioning, as it's used in that context, is defined as the rate in which strength or force can be exerted, or force times velocity. Maximum power is the point at which force multiplied by the speed of movement is maximal. On the typical force-velocity curve, the point of peak power is normally at the center of the curve. Numerous subcategories of strength and power have also been identified. Among these are high-speed strength, low-speed or high-load strength, reaction strength, explosive strength, and skill strength. This slide represents the definition of some of the differences between those different kinds of strength that I just described to you. You'll note that the conditions in which the five varying types of strength exist relate in some cases to maximal velocity and in some cases to the task. There is a description and an example on the right hand side that helps make sense of the categories I described. Now, this graph is an illustration of the relationships among low speed, high speed, and peak power areas on the force velocity curve. You'll notice that the low speed training makes use of heavy loads, and when using really heavy loads, it's considered to be neural training, whereas high speed strength training includes ballistic training and some plyometric training. And then the peak power is also represented here, and that's typically about 30% of the maximum voluntary isometric contractions. But this number can vary greatly, of course, depending on the individual. The eccentric training range shown at the bottom is with supramaximal loads and stands apart from the eccentric workload that accompanies high-speed stretch, short, and cycle movements. The basis for specificity of strength and power training are seen in the metabolic adaptations, the hypertrophy adaptations, and the neural adaptations. Of these, the specificity of neural adaptations to specific training variables appears to be the most prominent and perhaps the most important because of neural changes that have the most variability and thus must be targeted with the most precision. Skill-based measures are useful in occupational settings and in evaluating aerobic fitness. As you can see in the first picture, box lifting is used to evaluate lifting capacity when workers are engaged in manual material handling. The variables include the box size, the weight, and the placement height, and these can all be manipulated to evaluate job-specific capabilities. In the lower picture, we can see an assessment of aerobic power. It's a very functional test and dependent on specific motor skill proficiencies. This kayak ergometer provides better measures of aerobic performance in kayakers than do general aerobic testing. The physiological and neurophysiological adaptations that arise from strength and power training have been well investigated with strong evidence of changes in muscle and tendon hypertrophy and fascial arrangement, changes in metabolic and endocrine factors, and widespread changes in neural factors. Coinciding with these adaptations are changes in function, such as improved jumping height, easier occupational lifting, faster walking speed in the elderly, and faster sprinting performance in athletes. This table from Chapter 15 of Check, Tink, and Martin's third edition book on motor development illustrates the musculoskeletal adaptations to exercise and training. Despite all of what is known about strength and power, there are still considerable gaps in knowledge and controversies over even the most basic tenets of training. The greatest gaps exist in determining training methods that will improve actual day-to-day motor skill performance, whether that's on the athletic field, the job site, or activities of daily living. These problems are further highlighted in the measurement of strength and power, which suffers from the conflict between reliability and ecologic validity. That is, the most reliable and repeatable testing methods are not necessarily valid in terms of identifying the important strength components of athletes or workers in a vocational setting. As I said, evaluating functional strength and power in occupations or in athletes has long been a challenge due to the variables of reliability and validity and frankly the logistical issues of measuring and assessing in a real life scenario. Taking measurements in the field during actual tasks, for example, is beset by problems of reliability and logistics. Simplifying complex skill strength tasks so that they may be reliably performed in a laboratory or a field lab environment raises questions of validity. That is, does the test accurately reflect the demands of the real life performance? Bridging the gap between reliability and validity is the goal of functional testing using simulated and real life strength devices. Functional tests often come in the form of test batteries, and sometimes, particularly in football, you'll hear the word combine used in athletic evaluations and in job-related fitness tests in occupational settings. These figures that you see on the screen here are 3 examples of functional strength testing related to push-pull tasks. On the right is the squat push test, or the jammer, used by football players to assess the blocking ability. In the middle is an 80-kilogram dummy that's used by firefighters to test and train for personal rescue. And on the right is a push-pull machine used by some European police forces to assess the ability to restrain or push away a suspect. So which expression of strength do you think best reflects the strength and power demands required of the activity, and why? It's difficult to generalize that elite performers are more powerful, stronger, or faster than their sub-elite counterparts. In a similar manner, it's difficult to state that strength and power will improve on-field performance of high-level athletes, or even many aspects of performance of sub-elite performers. The inability to consistently correlate strength and power with high-level sport performance has led researchers to further investigate missing elements of strength and power production in sport. There is a growing recognition that maximal transfer of performance is dependent on intramuscular and intermuscular coordination factors. Eminent sports scientist Per Ergaard and his colleagues noted in their extensive review that improved neural function, including improved coordination, were among the adaptations enabling even aerobic athletes to benefit from heavy resistance training. The high intensity and explosive strength training found to be successful can be considered functional to running, cycling, and skiing because it addresses the rapid cyclical nature of the activities and the developed necessary stretch, shorten cycle mechanisms and contract relax coordination. Physiological challenges introduced into high training environments into the training environments create task specific coordination changes and better the transfer of strength and power to the athletic field. This has led to the development of the functional psychophysical training. This is a research study that was done by Julian and Hughes. The title of the paper is, Does a Short Period of Lower Limb Strength Training Improve Performance in Field-Based Tests of Running and Agility in Young Professional Soccer Players? You can see in this schemata up here, they are participating in an agility training circuit, and the direction of movement and the location of the movement coordinates of the tasks are indicated on this. So it's quite a complex requirement for this assessment. Now, this study assessed the effects of specific leg strength training as part of a broader exercise program on running speed and agility in, as I said, the young professional athletes. 26 males ages 17 to 19 were divided into three groups. The reference group performed individual technical work only. The coordination group performed, they're indicated by the CO, performed the circuit designed, this circuit designed to promote agility, coordination, and balance control, and together with some technical work. And finally, the squat group, or the SQ, underwent 3 series of 3 squat repetitions at 90% of their individual maximum value, and a sprint before competition of the agility, before completion of the agility circuit and some technical work. These specific training programs were performed 5 times a week for 3 weeks. Before the experimental session and at the end of each week, all players were assessed using 4 types of testing: an agility shuttle run style test with changes in direction, and 2 sprints over 10 and 7.32 meters respectively, with completion time being the only performance parameter recorded. The results indicated that in the short sprints or shuttle sprint with changes in direction, lower limb strengthening did not improve performance. Performance improved in all 3 groups in the agility test, but more so in the reference and coordination groups. So it appears that the soccer-specific training composed of exercise circuits specifically adapted to the different types of effort actually used in match play can enhance agility and coordination. Now this is simply a follow-up from the previous slide indicating the changes over time in the completion of the follow-up tests that I described previously. We're going to examine the concept of psychophysical training in a bit more detail, but take a look at this picture. Do you recall this kind of evaluation or assessment that we've done in our labs, where one participant needs to react to the actions of another participant? You'll remember that when we used the timing gates to measure this reaction by the speed in which the participant passed through the 2 timing gates. We're going to take a closer look at the 4 steps in functional psychophysical training, which is sometimes simply referred to psychophysical training rather than the functional component at the beginning. Step 1, is to determine the physiological, perceptual, and psychomotor factors and skills required for successful performance. This information can come from the scientific literature as well as coaches and athletes themselves. It may be necessary to draw upon data from similar sports if that is the only data available, but it's imperative that sport-specific characteristics be identified because the psychological skills for one sport or generic skills may not work for another sport. In the workplace settings, this is called task and demand analysis, in which requirements of the task, for example, loading boxes onto a conveyor belt, and the demands of the body, spinal compressive forces, strength, and cognitive processing, are evaluated both subjectively and objectively. A task and demand analysis requires assessment of psychological factors like decision-making, time pressures, and apprehension to fully understand the nature of the job. The second step is to use the data from the first step to determine the specific constraints that influence movement and performance outcomes and the obstacles that need to be overcome for performance to improve. Define these obstacles and constraints as problems to be solved. Compare and contrast this list to the specific characteristics and abilities of the individual, whether it's an athlete or a worker. For instance, the volleyball net is a constraint that needs to be overcome by the players. A volleyball player may have difficulty with the net because of an insufficient reach due to a short stature, poor jumping height, or poor reaching technique during jumping, or may have poor timing that prevents her from reaching her maximal jump height at the right moment. Of course, stature cannot be changed, but constraints that influence other factors may be movement of teammates or defenders that create jump timing problems, the net that forces the biomechanical alterations, fear of injury from landing on someone's foot, or maybe unfavorable muscle strength or body mass index that limits the jump height. All right, let's take a look at the next step. Creating a training environment that addresses the strength or power, as well as the psychomotor and mental factors necessary for performance. As a starting point, address mental effort, attention, and intention to determine the mental factors necessary for training. Training need not address all of these factors at once and can progress from simple to more complex. These psychological constraints should not overshadow the need for rigorous physiological challenges necessary to stress metabolic, morphologic, and neuromuscular systems. Yet these constraints should pose sufficient challenge to create a psychophysical instability that requires adaptations to take place. And finally, carefully present constraints, obstacles, and cues in a fashion that allows the athlete to discover on their own the best way to accomplish goals. Monitoring progress and presenting new constraints and obstacles when learning plateaus is critically important as well. Functional exercise prescriptions are quickly finding their place alongside or in place of general exercise programs for the added benefits they can provide. For instance, functional training is recommended for healthy persons in physically and psychologically demanding activities, particularly in the military, police, fire, and rescue work. Functional training for these professionals, sometimes referred to as tactical training, is often aimed at high-stress environments, interpersonal engagement, when a person carries or drags a body, for example, and equipment use. In their review of load carriage performance for soldiers, Napick and other authors reported that the largest gains in performance were a result of training that included progressive and overloaded load-carrying activities, in other words, functional activities, in addition to their other exercise programming, particularly upper body strength exercises. It should be noted that on page 297, there's a great example of this kind of functional tactical training for firefighters on 297 and the military, in particular military snipers on page 298. So think about how the individuals in this example perform under conditions of uncertain and often severe environmental challenges, high physiological and psychological stress, urgency, danger. The physiological needs change from moment to moment, ranging from cardiovascular endurance to running speed, extreme balance, and high muscular strength. In the left photo below, or on the screen, pardon me, the firefighter holds a high-powered hose with a fatiguing and awkward posture. The heavy turnout gear, smoke, perilous fire, and urgency make the task more physically and psychologically stressful. On the right, the danger of ladder climbing is evident. So with this in mind, what do you think a reasonable basic task and demand analysis for firefighters might look like. How might we best train these young men and women to be able to perform these tasks without increasing the risk to their life? Research on functional training in non-athletic populations is mostly directed at persons with disabilities, the elderly, or those requiring extensive rehabilitation. Physical and occupational therapists have long used added purpose training or task-oriented training and other functional rehabilitation techniques to provide better results than generic rehab strategies. This form of training is intended to provide purpose and meaning to enhance motivation and develop coordination mechanisms that are context specific and transfer better to real world activities. In addition to meaningful and motivating cognitive components, an effective functional training program may address other individual specific psychological and psychosocial aspects of movement. For instance, the quality of life of frail elders may be more associated with confidence over fall prevention than actual physical performance, and thus self-efficacy should be a target outcome of training programs in this vulnerable population. For relatively healthy persons with nagging problems, subacute injuries and illnesses, or a general decline due to aging, the available data and research regarding the success of functional training are abundant in some areas but really limited in others. The widely diverse needs of relatively healthy persons prevent definitive, generalized, and sweeping statements about what kinds of functional training work and for what purposes. Yet, it is well recognized that functional training for vocational and wellness purposes may reduce musculoskeletal pain and improve work performance. It may improve mobility function and activities of daily living in elders, and it may reduce falls for the elderly. Multimodal functional training interventions that include a cognitive component, in other words, psychophysical functional training, appear to be more effective than those without, and may provide adherence benefits that can't be found in regular training. It has been further noted that measuring the effectiveness of any balanced training program for elderly citizens should include dual task challenges, as they reveal the real-world capabilities of the participant. The use and benefit of functional training for non-athlete populations can be understood by examining the model of disablement. And it's shown here on small, and you'll see it a little bit larger in the next slide. The model of disablement tracks progression of health from pathology to disability. Pathology is the underlying disease or the physiological abnormality which contributes to the impairment. Impairment is a dysfunction in how the organs, the tissues, or the systems operate. Impairments may lead to a functional limitation, which are disruptions in one's day-to-day functioning. Should this disruption impair how one can function in society, then it becomes a disability. For most people, particularly middle-aged and older, most of us have some level of impairment and functional limitations. This could be joint and muscle pain, including arthritis and low back pain, subclinical coronary artery disease, overweightedness, disordered physiological and psychological stress response, and coping skills, etc., etc., etc. The model of disablement illustrates the progression of disease to disability. The goal of functional training, ultimately, is to stop impairments from becoming functional limitations and stop functional impairments from becoming disabilities. Improving functional health may increase one's activity level and psychological status, thereby having a positive effect on impairments and pathologies. You'll note in the description that you're reading on the slide that progression along the continuum is mostly left to right, hence the double arrows that we see. But not always, because there are the single arrows represented in this capacity as well. And it's not always direct, which is indicated by the curved nature of the arrows. Numerous risk factors include if and how one level of progresses to the next. And the key risk factor indicators are demographic, which includes age, socioeconomic status, and education. Physiological, in other words, body size, diet, and gender. Psychosocial, which is the level of anxiety, motivation, and social networks. Environmental, which could include your housing situation, the climate, the occupation in which you work in. and morbidities, such as hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and depression. You'll notice that the overlap among medical, exercise, and functional training interventions, but that the functional training targets a broader scope than other methods. An important target for functional training is the development of effective strategies to prevent functional limitations from becoming disabilities. The potential complexities in manipulating environmental and task constraints within a functional psychophysical training program may prohibit complete program development. Virtual reality, or VR, or virtual environments, VEs, may offer solutions to this complexity. Virtual environments range from simple computer video games to full surround video immersive rooms that can also monitor and react to body movements. Between these two extremes are the virtual reality headsets that project the virtual environment on the inside of the goggles worn by the user. Sensors in the headset detect head movement to which the virtual reality display responds. More sophisticated systems include sensors affixed to gloves or bodysuits to monitor limb and body movements. Some of these sophisticated technologies have made their way into consumer products, and of course, for those of you that are familiar with my doctoral work, it was done in the area of exergaming, which was used for the purposes of functional training with children and youth in a school setting. Virtual environments are currently being used with some promise in other training motor skill environments as well, and particularly in tactics with sports in mind. They're also used in occupations such as surgery, in which mistakes during actual practice have dire consequences. For similar reasons, the military has long used computer simulators to train pilots, or more recently to train teams of soldiers in combat missions, and to provide military stress inoculation. In their evaluation of computer simulated training for motor enhancement, Ward and his colleagues maintained that the psychological and information processing reality of the simulated environment and tasks are likely of greatest importance, as evidenced by reports showing that realism and level of information available in the graphical displays may alter the user's movement, biomechanics, and strategies. In this example of a clinical experiment being done with a virtual reality headset, the participant is standing on a balance platform. In this particular case, they actually have a foam pad on top, so you're familiar with that from our lab experiments in motor learning. And the difference, of course, here is that they're simulating an experience inside the virtual reality camera that we just don't quite have the capability to be able to do that yet, but hopefully someday. And it provides another example of how virtual reality is being used in motor rehabilitation to simulate functional activities that you encounter in everyday life. The use of virtual reality as an aid to physical training for relatively healthy persons has only been explored rigorously from the standpoint of adherence and mental health benefits. A majority of the data suggests that virtual reality exercise promotes exercise adherence and positive mood states, and this may be particularly the case when the virtual reality experience is in the form of exergaming. The particular benefits of exergaming environment may be due to the competitive enjoyment, as well as the requirement for an external focus of attention and purposeful physical effort directed toward the constraints of the virtual reality environment. The adherence benefits of virtual reality exercise has been applied to training for weight control, where most authors suggest that virtual reality training can promote exercise self-efficacy for sedentary and overweight children and adults. These effects are not necessarily universal, though, and factors such as gender, fitness level, physical intensity, demands of the virtual environment, virtual reality viewing perspectives, in other words, the first person or the third person. Other variables include the amount of user control interaction and the mode of exercise. All of these might influence the user's affinity for virtual reality exercise and the potential for its benefits. Though the informed use of virtual reality can be used to advance fitness and motor skills. As I've demonstrated, it's partly in my doctoral work and as we've read in much of the literature. It remains to be seen if true functional training benefits are possible. In the case of my studies, I was able to demonstrate the benefits of improved balance in an exergaming environment. Um, but but the but does that really mean that those functional training benefits are translatable to the real world environment? If I was to go back and measure those same grade 3 and 4 children now, will we be able to see an enhanced level or an increased level of postural control? There's only very limited data available, such as virtual reality rotational balance training to help ice dancers. That work was done by Tornese in 2011. Physically rigorous games like DDR, Dance Dance Revolution, may help with laboratory measures of balance, but it's really unknown if dance performance is truly improved. Other devices, such as the Parasea Speed School Quickness Trainer, have not been investigated yet. In summary, virtual reality and virtual experience functional training holds some promise, but the newness of this kind of training prevents having sufficient data and from making a firm recommendation about their effectiveness. That brings us to an end to Chapter 12, Functional Training. We haven't had any videos embedded into this OLM, but I will leave you with this last one, asking you to maybe take a look at this video. It really hits close to home for anybody that has any connections to the Canadian military. You can see that this idea and concept of what we're discussing in this chapter has applications to athletics and rehabilitation for those of you that are interested, but of course it has real life and real world examples and applications as well. And you can see in this video that I'll leave the URL for on the bottom of the screen. I'll also put it up into my YouTube channel so you can take a look at it. Represents the kinds of testing and evaluation that is functional in nature that our Canadian soldiers participate in. All right, that'll be the end of this chapter OLM.